Good morning, good day, and good evening. My name is Josephine Tan, and I am very honored and very delighted to be the one to introduce our plenary speaker, Dr. Fathali Moghaddam. Dr. Moghaddam is a professor of psychology and director of the interdisciplinary program in cognitive science at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Since 2014, he has served as the editor-in-chief of an APA journal called Peace and Conflict, Journal of Peace Psychology. Dr. Moghaddam was born in Iran and he was educated in England from an early age. In 1979, he returned to Iran with the revolution, and he was researching and teaching in Iran during the hostage-taking crisis and during the first 3 years of the Iran-Iraq War. After working for the United Nations, he came to Canada in 1984, where he researched and he taught in McGill University. And then in 1990, he moved to Georgetown. Dr. Moghaddam has conducted experimental research. He has done field research. He has been involved in applied projects, and he has worked in numerous cultural contexts, and he has published extensively on the psychology of conflict, terrorism, democracy, and dictatorship. He has published many articles and produced many books. The most recent one is called Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, and that one just came out, so you might want to check it out. The other more recent books are Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty, and that came out in 2019. That's The Psychology of Dictatorship, 2013, The Psychology of Democracy, 2016, Questioning Causality, Scientific Explorations of Cause and Consequence Across Social Contexts, published in 2016 with Ram Har. Then there's the encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia of Political Behavior, two volumes that came out in 2017. And this is a really good book too, Mutual Radicalization, the Psychology of How Groups and Nations Drive Each Other to Extremes, 2018. There's also The Psychology of Radical Social Change with B. Wagner and J. Valsina, 2018. Dr. Moghaddam has actually received a number of prestigious awards in recognition of his academic work. And I think you can see why the ICP invited Dr. Moghaddam to speak at our conference. We are living in a world that is filled with uncertainty, where democracy is being challenged by authoritarianism in many parts of the world. And so his work is of great relevance, of great importance to help us understand the changes that are going on. So it is my great pleasure to invite Dr. Moghaddam to deliver his presentation, which is entitled The Dictator Cometh, The Psychology of Rising Authoritarian Strongmen. I turn you now over to Dr. Moghaddam. Thank you.
In the 21st century, we are confronted by a huge challenge of declining democracy and freedoms and the rise of authoritarian strongmen, not just in non-Western societies, but also in Western societies. Now, in order to meet this challenge, psychology has to change some of its traditional approaches. Like most psychologists, I was trained to do 1-hour laboratory experiments, to think in fairly short-term perspectives. And we have to change from this approach, the traditional approach, the causal model of behavior that we adopt, to a more dynamic long-term perspective to try to understand changes over very long-term periods. Now, the challenge of authoritarianism, of course, is not new. the challenge of reversals from democracy to dictatorship are not new. If we go back to Athens 2,500 years ago, from that time, we've had quite a number of reversals. And one might think that a solution to the problem of dictatorship is to have revolutions. And unfortunately, when we look at the outcomes of revolutions, we find that that is not necessarily a good solution. The Arab Spring, the Iranian Revolution, typically these kinds of revolutions result in one dictatorship being replaced by another. Indeed, if we go back to the great revolutions, the French and the American revolutions, it took a very long time, several hundred years, before these revolutions actually led to actually influenced the outcome, being in terms of a more democratic society. So the question is, why is it that it takes so long to try to move from dictatorship? All major societies began as dictatorships, to try to move from dictatorships to democracy. Why does it take so long? And why is it so difficult? In order to answer these questions, I put forward the concept of political plasticity, which is about how fast and how much we can change political behavior. Now, of course, we've all heard of brain plasticity, but I'm more concerned with plasticity in behavior outside in the real world. And political plasticity is a concept that I use to try to explore changes that are viable and how fast they could come about in the political sphere. In terms of why there are reversals from democracy to dictatorship, there have been a number of very well-informed discussions before. For example, Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom is a wonderful book, focusing on the tensions of the modern world, the anxiety brought about by the modern world, the idea that human beings feel afraid, feel anxiety, because their traditional communities have been broken up, and they seek to relieve their anxiety and their fear by escaping to a dictator, the comfort of being led by a dictator. I don't accept this explanation, but I have another explanation, and the kinds of explanations I'm going to put forward today are all reflected, are based on three books. One is The Psychology of Dictatorship. The second is The Psychology of Democracy. And the third one, most recently, Threat to Democracy, The Appeal of Authoritarianism in an Age of Uncertainty. And all of these are published by American Psychological Association Press. So if I don't accept Erich Fromm's explanation, what alternative am I providing? I believe that one of the things we have to do in order to try to explain the 21st century experience of rising authoritarianism and declining freedoms and declining democracy, both in non-Western and Western societies, one of the things we have to do is to distinguish between types of freedom. One type of freedom is the traditional type of freedom, which is about individual free expression, individual movement, the type of freedom that we typically think about when we discuss human rights. The Human Rights Declaration from the United Nations is based on this kind of freedom. But there is an alternative kind of freedom that is particularly supported by authoritarian strongmen. The second type of freedom is attached freedom. Attached freedom in contrast to detached freedom. Detached freedom is about individuals deciding and moving and acting as independent agents. Attached freedom is about freedom through collectives. It is about freedom and glory through the group. It is the kind of freedom that the authoritarian strongman supports and propagates, and the kind of freedom that Hitler was talking about when he talked about the Third Reich lasting 1,000 years, the glory that is achieved through being a member of that group. It's the type of freedom that is discussed when people talk about making America great again and closing the borders to outsiders. Why? Because through belonging to that great America, through sharing the glory of that great America, the individual feels a type of freedom that can only be achieved through that collective experience, through that collective membership. And of course, the authoritarian strongman argues that, or propagates that, it is only he who can lead this group. It is only through his leadership that this group can achieve glory and freedom in the collective sense. And you too can be a member of that glorious group that will achieve wonders historically. So in discussing this explanation of the appeal of authoritarian strongmen in this era, one of the things I do is distinguish between different types of freedom. And I emphasize particularly freedom through collective glory, freedom through collective action. And it is where the individual can become merged with the group, with the collective, become one with others, led by the authoritarian strongman. Of course, this process is taking place in the context of globalization. And globalization is the source of many of the threats that the strongman, authoritarian strongman, is trying to defend against. What is it about globalization that leads to these threats? First, globalization involves the movement of people and vast numbers of people moving rapidly and interacting with others who are dissimilar to them. This rapid movement of people represents a threat for many nationalists in particular. When nationalists perceive, when they see that there are these large numbers of dissimilar others arriving on their borders at very fast pace, suddenly 1 million Syrians move from the Middle East to Europe. Suddenly, millions of Mexicans are moving across the US border and coming up from the south. These kinds of rapid movements represent a threat, particularly for those who are personality-wise authoritarian. Now, we have a lot of research in psychology of the authoritarian personality from the 1950s, from the era when psychologists were engaged in this question of what may the authoritarian personality was a key. Authoritarian personalities being the type of people who were categorical thinkers. Um, they were particularly against dissimilar others or minorities right across the board. They were particularly dogmatic in their support of strong leadership, particularly intolerant of ambiguity. And just as they followed the leader, they also hammered down on those below them, those that they saw below them, as dissimilar minorities, as those who were different from the in-group. So one of the key themes here in focusing on the authoritarian personality is that this personality is very similar across the board, across societies, and is characteristic of extremism in religion, in politics. It is a characteristic that some psychologists would claim is only found in right-wing groups, but I believe that authoritarianism is dangerous and also found in left-wing extremists. It really doesn't seem to me to be very different if you are the victim of Stalin or Hitler, whether it's right-wing or left-wing. It's all the same outcome. And of course, I experienced this kind of victimization after the revolution in Iran, when Islamic fundamentalists lost Iranians the chance to have a democracy. Right after the dictator Shah was deposed, Islamic extremism came into power and re-established dictatorship in Iran, now under the leadership of a mullah. So it doesn't seem to me any different if the authoritarian is religious or secular, left-wing or right-wing. The key psychological characteristics of authoritarianism are the same, and their opposition to freedom, to individual freedom, to what I have called detached freedom. The opposition to detached freedom is adamant, and it doesn't matter what the details are. You find the same cluster of psychological characteristics in the authoritarian personality across different societies. So I've argued that globalization has a very important role in raising threats, and one of these threats arises out of the movement of people across borders, and of course the movement of ideas across borders, and the movement of cultures across borders, in large part through the internet. So we have this situation where the in-group is being threatened by invasions. Either it's invasions of Muslims to Europe, or Mexicans in America, different types of invasions. And the authoritarian personality reacts by supporting aggressive leadership, authoritarian leadership, and by trying to expel what they see to be dissimilar others. These problems that have arisen in the 21st century, with a decline in freedoms, decline in democratic tendencies, decline in open societies, and this is all mapped out by groups like Journalists Without Borders, by Freedom House, by other sources that are objectively looking at and monitoring and charting the trends in freedoms around the world. What we have is a decline in freedom. And the question is, well, what can we do about it? What are the options for us? First of all, as psychologists, we have to reorient ourselves. We have to come out of our 1-hour laboratory experiments, and we have to look historically. And we have to think about what I have termed political plasticity. The possibility of changing political behavior, how fast and how much we can change. Let me give you an example of where political plasticity seems to be very limited so far, and how change is very difficult. Consider the topic of leadership. All major human societies over the last 11, 12,000 years where we've had settlements, all major human societies have had leaders. And as far as we can tell, in major societies, most of the time the leaders have been men. In the United States, after such a long time, we still do not have a woman in the White House. We still do not have a change in that respect. Most of the presidents have been older males. Now, this is part of what I call rigidity in political plasticity. It's very difficult to change leader-follower relationships in this respect. Most leaders still continue to be male, still to continue to be of a particular type in terms of personality, in this respect, that they seek power, they desire power, and they tend to very often veer towards authoritarianism when given the chance. So these kinds of rigidities in behavioral change have to be kept in mind by psychologists when we think about solutions to this decline of freedoms and democracy we have experienced recently. Another factor we have to think about is, in terms of rigidities of political plasticity, is a relationship between perceived threat and in-group reactions. In psychology, we know that when a group experiences threat, they typically become more conformist. They typically support strong aggressive leadership. They typically will not tolerate deviance within the group. There are all these factors that serve as rigidities. And as I mentioned, globalization brings with it a number of threats. Of course, there are threats that are not necessarily in the control of any particular government, such as terrorism. Terrorism is a threat, and through empirical research, what we've shown is that when people feel threatened by terrorism, they tend to have lower support for human rights and civil liberties. This tendency that when we feel threatened, our support for civil liberties declines, seems to be another one of the rigidities associated with political plasticity. That is, human beings seem to have evolved in such a way that when they are threatened, when their group is under pressure, when they feel that their life is threatened in a serious way within the group, they react in predictable ways. And one of those ways seems to be to have lower support for freedoms and civil liberties. Now, that's another rigidity in relation to political plasticity. We have to keep in mind all the time that the processes we're discussing really involve context more than individual personality. In explaining the threats to democracy and the decline of freedoms, I'm emphasizing what I call contextual factors, and I've developed a model that I call the Springboard Model to Dictatorship, Springboard Model, which highlights again the contextual factors that lead to either the continuation of dictatorship or the start of a new dictatorship. Now, what do I mean by the springboard? It's a very simple idea. The idea is that under certain conditions, a springboard comes to life, and this springboard can be used by a potential dictator to spring to power. My argument is that in terms of personality factors, in all human groups, there are potential dictators. We all know this from our colleagues at work and our families. There are always potential dictators in terms of personality factors. Of course, there's always something special about the potential dictator. The potential dictator tends to want power, be narcissistic, be Machiavellian. They have these cluster of personality characteristics, be dogmatic, categorical in thinking. We know these things. But that's not enough to become a dictator. To become a dictator, the next step is the springboard to dictatorship has to be in place. And that springboard comes into place through a number of contextual factors, historical factors, economic factors, social factors. They combine to bring to life this dictatorship springboard. The springboard to dictatorship was in place in the 1930s in Germany. Of course, the potential dictator has a role in bringing to place, in creating the springboard. Hitler had a role in creating the springboard that he used to spring to dictatorship in Germany. And certainly, Khomeini, in my experience, had a role in bringing to life the springboard to dictatorship that he used in Iran to spring to dictatorship, authoritarian rule in Iran. We had about a year of relative freedom in Iran from 79 to the beginning of the 80s, but very quickly freedom was snuffed out. And in that time, the springboard to dictatorship was reconstructed by the Islamic fanatics, and it was used by Khomeini to spring to power and to re-establish a dictatorship in Iran. This springboard to dictatorship highlights the importance, the priority of the context in trying to understand dictatorship and how it comes about. It is not just the work of an individual such as Hitler. It is not just the work of an individual with a certain personality type, but it is the individual with the potential to become a dictator using the springboard to dictatorship to rise to power, to grab power, and then move on and exterminate all enemies. That's typically the way with dictatorships when they begin, unfortunately. So in discussing the rise of authoritarian strongmen in the 21st century, I have highlighted the kinds of threats brought about through globalization. I've highlighted the changing circumstances we're living in. And I believe another of the threats that we have to keep in mind that will be associated with the rise of authoritarian strongmen, another of the threats is global warming. Global warming is going to create a lot of new threats for us, not just in terms of psychological threats, but also real material threats. Global warming is going to bring ruin to many farmers. It's going to bring ruin to many businesses. It's going to bring new opportunities for other people and other businesses. So there's going to be a lot of changes over the next half a century, even as we grapple to come to grips with global warming. We're going to be faced with a lot of rapid change, a lot of rapid disasters through weather, through extreme weather, through all kinds of changes that are going to come about. And this is going to raise substantially the perception of threat. People around the world are going to be feeling threatened. And we know that when people feel threatened, there are a number of predictable reactions. They become more ethnocentric. They become more supportive of strongmen and potential dictators. And they are typically less supportive of civil liberties. All of these things point to greater dangers, and it's important for psychologists to be standing up and pointing these dangers out early, pointing out that we're going to be facing these dangers and we have to make plans. We have to try our best to avert the decline in democracy. Of course, as I mentioned, we have to also think historically. We have to look back to the last 2,500 years at least, and remember that democracy has not been on a smooth upward increase. It hasn't been the case that we have been experiencing greater and greater democracy. The ride has been very, very rough, and it promises to be rougher in the future. Now, what can we do? What are the possibilities for us in terms of what we can bring about as psychologists? What can we do to help democracy survive, to help freedom survive, to support civil liberties, and to prevent the rise of authoritarian strongmen? And of course, this is a grave danger because we can see these strongmen either in power or on the wings waiting to grab power. So this is a severe danger. What can we do as psychologists? I believe one of the things we can do is to put forward ideals and describe their psychological characteristics in terms of what are the goals we are aiming to achieve. This is a very ancient tradition of psychologists and others putting forward some kind of an ideal. And what I did in terms of ideals in democracy, I wrote a book called The Psychology of Democracy, and put forward an ideal of the kind of democratic citizen that would be useful in supporting democracy, and the psychological characteristics of the democratic citizen. The question is, what psychological characteristics should the democratic citizen have in order to be able to support, to sustain a democracy? Because we know that democracies, in order to thrive, in order to move forward, in order to flourish, they must have democratic citizens supporting them. And the question is, what kinds of psychological characteristics must this democratic citizen have? In the book, The Psychology of Democracy, my goal was to outline very clearly the characteristics of the democratic citizen, the ideal that we should be trying to nurture. And of course, this nurturance comes through education, it comes through socialization, through the family, it comes through ultimately psychologists teaching society the direction it should take with respect to the psychological characteristics of the democratic citizen. Now, the ideal I put forward, of course, is there to debate. It's something that I put forward as an idea. And it has 10 characteristics, this democratic citizen. And it starts with the idea that the democratic citizen must be able to begin any interaction, any dialogue, any negotiation, any process of communications and learning with the acknowledgement that I could be wrong. I could be wrong. Now, that seemed like a very simple step, but actually it's a step that excludes enormous numbers of people. For example, if you are a religious fundamentalist, you cannot begin the process by saying I could be wrong, because your faith in your religion is dogmatic. This is one of the things I faced again in Iran when I was interacting with fundamentalist Muslims. They cannot start the dialogue with I could be wrong, because their faith is dogmatic, their belief is dogmatic, and they begin with the dialogue with you are wrong. Not I could be wrong, but you are wrong. So this beginning that I could be wrong is just one of 10 steps. Second, the democratic citizen must say, I have to critically assess everything, including the sacred beliefs of my society. So it's not just I who could be wrong, but it's my society that could be wrong. So I have to question the sacred beliefs of my society. I have to be willing to bring into questioning everything that is in my society. So obviously, this is not possible if you are an extreme ethnocentric, nationalist, etc. A third step is that I must revise my opinion as the evidence requires. So if I look into myself saying I could be wrong, if I look into my society saying that even the sacred beliefs of my society could be wrong, and I discover that there are things that are wrong, then I have to change my mind about some things. So I have to be open to the possibility of changing my opinion. And again, if you are an extremist of the left or right, it becomes very difficult. The fourth characteristic of the democratic citizen is the ability to learn from others who are different. The idea that I must be open in my interactions with those who are different from me. Sometimes they're completely different from me. I must be open to learning from them. Now, again, this creates tensions because as psychologists, we know that in interpersonal and intergroup relations, similarity attraction is the key. Dissimilar others are not attractive to us typically. I know that they are attractive to us in Hollywood movies, but actually psychological research shows that similarity attraction is the key. So being open to learn from dissimilar others is a challenge as well. And fifth, I must seek to better understand those who are different from me. I must seek to better understand those who are different from me. And again, this goes against the trend of similarity attraction that we know well in psychology. And I can learn from those who are different from me. This is very important, being open to interactions with those others who are different from us, being open to learning from us, and even the possibility that we can learn from different others is abhorrent to many people under present circumstances. But I'm putting forward this picture of the psychological citizen as an ideal. Another characteristic of the psychological citizen supportive of democracy is that she or he will seek information and opinions from as many sources as possible, that they will not confine themselves in the way we do often in echo chambers, where we express ourselves only to others who agree with us. So this characteristic is very important, of seeking information from different sources, even from sources that we know disagree with us. And I should be open to experiences, to new experiences, and I should be open to creating new experiences for others. This is very much in line with some aspects of what we would like to have in diverse societies. In diverse societies where there are many different groups, the ideal would be to be open to the experiences and cultures that other groups offer us, and to open up so that they can learn from us as well. So far, I've emphasized certain aspects of the democratic citizen in terms of personality, what we want to develop, openness, the willingness and ability to question the self and one's own society, to learn from others who are different from ourselves, to be open to new experiences and to share experiences with others. And there is a danger here now, because I've gone through these 8 first characteristics. There is a danger that we will end up with a completely relativistic person, somebody who is not anchored morally. And the last 2 characteristics that I emphasize are for anchoring, are for making sure that this is a principled person and not totally relativistic. So the 9th characteristic of the democratic citizen is that she or he says and believes there are principles of right and wrong, that there are certain principles of right and wrong. And 10th, finally, not all experiences are of equal value. So it's not a situation where this person is going around the world saying, I will experience everything in the same way. There's no difference between the telephone book and Shakespeare's plays. No, it's not a relativistic person. It is a principled person who, at the same time, is open to experiences and open to self-criticism and criticism of the in-group. So what I've done here is, in this book, Psychology of Democracy, I've outlined what I believe to be, in terms of psychological characteristics, the important features of a person who can sustain and support a democracy and help it to thrive. And I believe it is worth talking about such ideals because they help us to focus more on exactly what we are trying to achieve as psychologists and in our relationship with the larger society. Thank you very much. I look forward to further discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Moghaddam. You've given us a lot of things to think about. That was a really excellent presentation. I believe that Dr. Moghaddam is with us today, right now.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, hello. What a wonderful presentation. We really enjoyed it. And we also, have several questions for you. Just in terms of structuring the rest of the session, we have a lot of time for discussion. According to my clock, it's now 10:18. We have until 10:55, and if we have time, maybe we can also talk a little bit about your next book. So I myself have a lot of questions, and there's been a very active chat that's been going on while you were presenting. So one of the questions is about whether there's any differences between the left and the right-wing authoritarianism, or do they sort of borrow from each other's playbook?
That's an excellent question. The research on the personality of authoritarianism has been spearheaded in the last 30 years or 40 years or so by Bob Altmaier, who's a Canadian researcher. I got to know his work when I used to work at McGill University in Canada. And Bob Altmaier labels his measure of authoritarianism as a right-wing authoritarianism. And there are a number of psychologists who agree with Bob Altmaier that authoritarianism is really right-wing. But it seems to me, if we look at the consequences of authoritarianism, look at the situation from the perspective of the victim. It seems to me, if you are a victim in Stalin's Soviet Union, or if you're a victim in Hitler's Nazi Germany, the consequences for you are very similar. If you're a victim in the Islamic Republic, if you're a victim in North Korea or Russia or China, it seems to me that the outcome is terrible for victims. Sure, the ideology espoused by the authoritarian leader is different in China, is different in Russia, is different in Iran, is different in North Korea, but the consequences for victims are very similar. And I would argue that if you look at the personality of the authoritarian leader, the basic characteristics of the authoritarian leader is the same in these different regimes. To give you one example of the kinds of characteristics I'm talking about, if you look at, for example, Khomeini, if you look at Putin, if you look at Stalin, Hitler, any of these leaders, including some of the contemporary leadership in Western societies, what you find is the claim that they are all knowing. They are all knowing. That's why they end up attacking scientists. That's why they end up attacking science. If they were in our meeting today, they would dismiss all of us and say they know much more about psychology than we do. That's why you have somebody like Trump coming on national TV suggesting, proposing that we inject Lysol as a way of solving COVID-19. This kind of idiotic suggestion is part of a pattern. It doesn't come out of the blue. If you go back to Stalin in the Soviet Union, he victimized some of the top geneticists of his time. He victimized them. He put them in jail. Why? Because he believed he knew more about genetics than they did. Just as if you look at these extremist radio shows, extremist networks right now, they're attacking Fauci. Why? Because they think they know better than he does. So for me, at least, there is really no difference between left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism. The dictator has a number of psychological characteristics that are consistent and persistent. And as a victim, I certainly don't see any difference between them.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Another line of discussion that's been going on in the chat is about what we can do to sort of promote democracy. And one of the things that has been the word springboard conditions has been discussed among the chat. So I'm kind of wondering, what suggestions would you have for psychologists, for us? What are the springboard conditions that you think are of most critical that we should be addressing right now?
That's a great question. I think psychologists have a very heavy duty, a heavy responsibility. We represent the science that is about human behavior. So we have a duty to take part in what's going on. So that's the first point, that psychologists cannot be neutral. They have to be engaged. A second point I would make is that we have to be critical of our own discipline. We have to be critical of our traditional approaches. One of my favorite courses to teach, perhaps it's my favorite course to teach, is general psychology. When I get 18 or 19-year-old students coming into my class, and I'm always using standard textbooks to teach this class. But I don't know if you've had a look at a standard general psychology textbook recently. You won't find any discussion that is relevant to what we're talking about. The discipline of psychology is out of touch with what we're talking about. So in terms of what can we do? Well, we can criticize our own discipline and get it to engage with what we think is important. And we can do this in different ways. Practicing psychologists can do it by talking about this issue and saying, look, the way we are training the next generation of psychologists is just not adequate. It's not correct. It's not going to get them involved in the right kinds of things. Now, third, in terms of the springboard situation we're in, one of the characteristics of the springboard to dictatorship is perceptions of threats. Perceptions of threats. And of course, the potential dictator intuitively knows this. One of the things about potential dictators is that they are intuitive psychologists. They don't need to read research. They intuitively know that when they give speeches, they have to keep focusing on threats. That's why there's a focus in America on the threat of invasions from the South, why we have to build walls, why we have to protect ourselves against these invasions. That's when Trump said he wants immigrants from Norway, which is quite funny. I have people writing to me from Norway saying, why on earth would we want to come to America? We have a social support system here that's superior. So what we can do is highlight this issue of threats and talk to people about threats and educate people that when our society is highlighting threats, there are consequences. So what we can do is educate our friends, educate our students, educate our clients in every way, and to discuss these things openly. The fourth thing I think we should keep in mind is that we're talking about long-term processes. You know, when we think about democracy, it's a long-term fight. It's not a matter of 5 years or 10 years. It's a long-term fight. There have been many reversals in history from democracy, from more openness to less openness. It's happened again and again. You know, I mentioned Athens 2,500 years ago. From Athens onwards, we have many examples of societies being more open, then being taken over by different forms of dictatorship. I don't know if any of you live in the New York area and went to the Medici exhibit at the Met. They had a wonderful exhibit of the Medici and the arts they support. Well, when you look at the details of what happened, Florentine Republic had some freedoms. They actually used to have authorities, people in government being voted in by at least a small number of voters. The Medici came along and closed that. They ended that. They finished off the Florentine Republic and established their own dictatorship. Now, you could say, well, Florence was never a true democracy. Well, that's true. Athens wasn't a true democracy. Athens gave the vote to free men, not women, not slaves. About 2,000 years later, we had the American Revolution. And I keep pointing this out. The American Revolution went back to Athens. It gave the vote to free men, not women, not slaves. It took another several hundred years before women got the vote. And we are now in a situation where minorities are still struggling to have the vote. If you look at the last few years, all kinds of changes have been taking place in certain states, Arizona, Texas, etc., restricting voting rights. So democracy is a struggle. It doesn't come naturally and it doesn't come easily. It doesn't come in the short term. It's a long-term struggle, and we can always go backwards. which we have been doing recently.
Thank you. The questions keep coming in. I hope to get through quite a bit of them, if not all. But here's one question. Could it be that the characteristics of the authoritarian leaders is not a set of psychological traits, but more to do with the circumstances that they face, the idea that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely?
Excellent question. We have empirical psychological evidence that power corrupts. There have been a number of very good empirical studies that show ordinary personalities can be corrupted by power. Historical evidence also shows that power corrupts. I think of Mandela, the South African leader, and George Washington as two exceptional individuals. Why? Because at a time when they could have had power, they stepped aside. George Washington was extraordinary. He set the whole tradition of term limits. Mandela could have had absolute power in South Africa. He stepped aside. But there are not many of these individuals, and I agree that power corrupts, but I don't think that it's all contextual. I do believe that the personality of the individual also matters. Unfortunately, when I went back to Iran in '79, we did not have Mandela leading the country. If we had Mandela, we might have moved closer to an open society. We had Khomeini, and Khomeini, in terms of his characteristics, he is a categorical thinker, he is dogmatic, ethnocentric, highly focused on the idea that he is the best person to make decisions. So he had all those characteristics that I see important in dictators. If you look at Hitler, Mussolini, all these people who came through in the 1930s as dictators, they certainly had certain personality characteristics that are important. So it's the characteristics of the individual, but in context. Now, in context, the 1920s and 30s were important as a context. And here I would add that in looking back at that time in history, we tend to whitewash. We tend to simplify. Very few people realize that during the 1920s and 30s, fascism and fascist movements, such as the Nazi movement, were supported not just in Germany and not just in Italy, but they were supported in England. They were supported in the United States. Hitler had strong support in England. A lot of aristocrats in England supported Hitler. Sir Oswald Mosley was the leader of the fascist movement in England. He had strong support from the aristocracy. He had strong support from the king, who came into power briefly in England, then abdicated. The king actually went and met with Hitler. He was a supporter of Hitler. He was an embarrassment once the war started, but what I'm pointing out is that the context was pro-fascist in many ways. So Oswald Mosley used to march in London with huge numbers, and he was anti-Semitic and pro-Hitler, pro-Nazi. So the context of the time was important. By the way, Hitler also had important support from key people in the United States. That's why the US was so late in entering that war. Very key people supported Hitler in the United States.
Thank you. We have another question here, and it has to do with social media. Political powers are trying to control social media so they can manipulate perception of threats, right? And behavior. So what can we do in this area when billions of people are actually getting their information from the social media?
Another very timely question. You know, if we look back to the optimism of 30 years ago, people were so optimistic about what the computer age would do for us and what the internet would do for us. We thought about how everybody would have access to greater and greater amounts of information. We thought about how people stuck in dictatorships would be able to have freedom of information. We thought about how the internet would equalize, and the poor in the United States and in other Western countries would now have access to education, to information. But unfortunately, that has not happened. First of all, dictatorships such as China have basically created their own internet and controlled the information that is coming in. Smaller dictatorships like Iran are trying to do the same. So there is heavy censorship in some parts of the world. That's the first thing. Second, in the West, in the United States and Europe and other Western countries, we've had a trend of echo chambers, where people are using the internet to interact with others who have the same beliefs as themselves, and they are endorsing one another's views, sometimes extremist views, sometimes extremely prejudiced views, anti-minority views, anti-women views. So these echo chambers are simply serving to reinforce radicalism. Now, this is something that was predictable from a psychological perspective. Why? Because there's a lot of psychological research showing that similarity attraction is the key in social relationships. We're attracted to others who are similar to us, who believe the same things as us, who endorse our own views. In my research, I spend several hours a week at least listening to, reading radical perspectives, radical views. And I'm always in a bad mood when I'm doing this work. You know, after 3 hours of listening to a radio show of extreme right wing or left wing or whatever it is, you know, they're spouting hatred. They're saying all these things that I disagree with, and I come out with a very bad mood. It's difficult interacting with others who disagree with us, who constantly tell us we're wrong or say things that we believe are completely wrong. So this is another role for psychologists. I believe psychologists should step in more to highlight the characteristics of these extremist echo chambers, to show what is going on. It's difficult work. It's work that is not immediately rewarding, but I think it is our role to point this out, how the electronic communication systems are in some ways working against democracy. Now, should the government step in and control? Well, I believe that's a very dangerous path. Once the government steps in, the question is, what criteria are they using? Who do they shut down? We can use some criteria. For example, it seems to me that groups that support violence should definitely be shut down or monitored very closely. Increasingly, these violent groups are homegrown. They are not from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and there's just so many questions, that we have for you. And I know it's lack of time, and maybe we can have you back, at another meeting, invite you back. It's absolutely fascinating. I do want to let people know that later today, we do have the the networking cafe at 2:15 Eastern time. And this is where people can get together and have discussions. So if people want to spend some time during that networking cafe to talk further and discuss, we can meet there. And if Dr. Moghaddam is there, maybe we can continue our discussion with him as well. The other thing is, we have a few more minutes here. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about your new book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist.
Thank you very much. I'd be delighted to. This book comes out of my efforts, and I think all psychologists should be doing this, to really reevaluate what we are taught in psychology. As you know, in universities, particularly in universities, psychologists do their best to distance themselves from the arts and humanities and to position themselves as part of science. So we psychologists want to be next to chemists and biologists and physicists, not areas like English literature. And I think this is a terrible, terrible tragedy, because there is so much that we can learn from the arts and humanities. Just because I do empirical research doesn't mean that I have to distance myself from English literature. And in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, what I did was to argue that the beginnings of experimental psychology can actually be found in early modern literature. And specifically, I use the example of Shakespeare's plays. And I discuss a number of well-known Shakespeare plays, such as Hamlet. And I show how in these plays, Shakespeare has inserted psychological experiments. And I argue that Shakespeare should be considered as working in the scientific revolution that was taking place in his time. And I discuss examples of how Shakespeare was knowledgeable about the psychological revolution taking place at his time. And I discussed the concept of thought experiments. And I discuss examples of scientists such as Albert Einstein, who only did thought experiments. You know, Einstein is, for me at least, among the 2 or 3 greatest scientists ever. Did he spend his time in labs? Did he do 1-hour experiments? No. All he did was thought experiments. And over a century later, we're still trying to catch up with Einstein. His ideas were so far ahead. For example, he died, as far as I know, not knowing whether there are black holes or not, but he put forward this idea. And here we are over a century later, talking about experimenting, researching black holes. He came up with these ideas through thought experiments. And I argue in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, that Shakespeare used thought experiments in his plays. He is doing experimental psychology through thought experiments. And we psychologists should not be trying to distance ourselves from English literature. We should be interacting, we should be learning from, particularly in therapy, particularly in practice. It seems to me the narrative approach is very central. So in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, I've tried to go against the mainstream approach of distancing ourselves from the humanities and the arts.
Thank you so much. I want to let everybody know, that Dr. Moghaddam has written very widely on this topic, and he has several books, and I certainly have read his work, and I'm very, very interested. It's very fascinating, it's very informative, and it really helps me to try to understand what's happening in the world today. So I want to show you, like, for example, this is one book, okay, Threat to Democracy. And then these are the 2 I have at hand. The others are in my lab, and I'm actually streaming from home. So here you go. That's one book, okay? And there are many more. And then, of course, the latest one is Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist. So I want to remind everybody that at 2:15 today, we do have the networking cafe. And I would encourage people to turn up. And if Dr. Moghaddam has time, if he wants to drop in, we would very much welcome him so that we can just ask him more questions. So between now and 2:15, I'm sure everybody will have time to sort of ponder and reflect and come up with more questions and go, oh, I sure wish I had asked that question. Well, maybe you might have a chance at 2:15. So we are coming up to it's about 10:50, but I think maybe we can break here, give everybody a rest to, to go off and maybe have a drink or something before the next session start, which is a symposium on climate justice. And I see a chat, I think, from Mary that says, say go and gallery view. Okay, everybody go to gallery view and put on your video, if you would, please. And we want to take a photograph, a screenshot with Dr. Moghaddam.
No. We want to also.
Very fascinating talk. Very fascinating. And remember, our sessions are being recorded and they will be posted on the ICP 2021 website after the conference. So you can review his talk again in case you want to listen, in case you miss anything. Okay, so Mary, have you taken screenshots of us?
Yes, I have. But I also just wanted Dr. Moghaddam to see that we are here. And this was so engrossing. And thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And
Bye-bye for
I'll
now.
see you.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And I'll be in touch with you, Dr. Moghaddam. I'll
Thank you very
communicate with
much.
you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
So just
you.
everybody remember, take a break, but don't leave the meeting. Come back. We'll start again on the hour.